Your Steve Jones Show podcast is loading now. The Steve Jones Show podcast is sponsored by Sunbury Motors, North 4th Street in Sunbury, and Sunbury Motors Kia, routes 11 and 15 in Hummel's Wharf. Taking your calls at 800-795-9565. This is The Steve Jones Show on News Radio 1070 WKOK. Now, from the Sunbury Motors Studio, here's Steve Jones.
Great to have you with us today. Sponsored by our good friends at Sunbury Motors, 4th Street in Sunbury. Sunbury Motors Kia, routes 11 and 15. Hummel's Wharf online at sunburymotors.com. And great to be joined by another one that's among the absolute best in the business, and that's Kenny Albert. Kenny, great to have you with us. Hope you're enjoying your summer.
Thanks for having me, Steve.
I do have to start with Vin Scully. I said earlier, I feel like he gave all of us the blueprint as to how to do certain things in this job. Now, you grew up around it because your father is in the same category. Your thoughts on Vin Scully's life and career?
Well, I think similar to you and so many of the listeners, never turned down the opportunity to listen or watch one of his broadcasts. He was like a poet. I tweeted earlier, it was a perfect game whenever Vin Scully stepped into a broadcast booth. Best ever, certainly in the sport of baseball. Heard so many stories about him while I was growing up, and then having the opportunity to be around him a little bit when I started working baseball games back in the late 90s. Did not know him at all. Had one conversation with him, which I'll get to in a moment, which was so memorable. But I worked several years with Jeff Torborg in the late 90s on Fox cable baseball games on Thursdays and Saturdays. And Jeff had played for the Dodgers for nearly a decade back in the 60s and early 70s. And he was behind the plate when Sandy Koufax pitched the perfect game in 1965. And that's one of the Vin Scully moments that people, refer to all the time, how perfect it was during that ninth inning at Dodger Stadium. So I would hear so many stories from Jeff Torborg about Vin Scully and their days together. And whenever we had a Dodgers game, Jeff would always go over and spend time, but I didn't know him at all, and I felt like I was intruding if I went over to sit down and join in the conversation. So I would stay over at my table. The only conversation I really ever had with him was in 2016, which was his last year, and I was out there to work a Dodgers game, and on a Friday night, I inquired with a couple of the people that worked with Vin Scully in his booth if it would be possible to take a picture, just to have as a memory. And I had heard that people were doing this all year long, opposing broadcasters, players, even managers and coaches. They would go up to the press box and have the chance to take a photo with Vin. And they told me, sure, come by tomorrow. He'll be there to do radio because I was working the TV broadcast. And if you come at 10:50, he'll have 5 minutes for you. And they would slot it out. 5 or 6 people every game prior to the game would have a 5-minute time slot. So I went in there, and they did not let us take photos on the cell phone. They wanted it to be perfect. So they actually had a photographer with a real camera who took the picture of you and Vin, and he would send it to you on a file later on. So it was a professional photo, and then there was an opportunity just to chat for 2 minutes or so, and I'm sure he was asked so many of the same questions that year about his favorite games and memories and Jackie Robinson, et cetera. I came from a totally different angle, and you'll appreciate this, Steve. I had seen an interview that Vin had done with Bob Miller, the great longtime Los Angeles Kings broadcaster, and they talked a little bit about hockey. And Vin was a childhood fan of the New York Rangers, the team that I work for. And during this interview with Bob Miller, he reminisced about going to games back in his high school days. So when I was in the booth, right after we took the photo, I said, I just have one question for you. I do the radio for the New York Rangers. I heard your interview with Bob Miller. What do you remember about those days? And without missing a beat, and this was 70-plus years later, after Vin Scully was in high school, attending Rangers games, he said to me, and I'm not going to even try to imitate his voice because I wouldn't do it any justice, but in that magical tone, he told me that he used his high school ID to get into MSG, And then he started rattling off names of Davy Kerr and Brian Hextall and Lester Patrick and some of the other Rangers from the late 30s and early 40s who he watched play. And there's no way he anticipated this question. He probably hadn't thought about these names for 70 years. And they came, back in his memory like it was yesterday. So, again, I was probably the only one to ever ask him that question, but he gave me the perfect answer.
It's interesting because it was announced today that Eli Gold, who does Alabama football, is going to have to miss at least the first month. And I've known Eli for a long time. Eli grew up in New York, and he would get into the Garden, the old Garden, then the new one, the newer one, and he'd sit in the last row because he was a huge Rangers fan. It's a lot of things. And he's the Alabama play-by-play guy.
Right.
So he was a huge Rangers guy, too.
No, it's great. It's great to hear some of the old stories. And you referenced my father earlier. He was an intern for the Brooklyn Dodgers before they moved to Los Angeles.
Really?
In the mid-1950s. He was 14 or 15 years old. And among his duties, most of the games were played in the afternoon back then. So he would listen to Vin Scully when the team was on the road. And he would update a manual scoreboard that was facing out onto the street at Ebbets Field. So as an intern, he updated the scoreboard during the day. He also would bring tickets when they played several games a year in Jersey City. He would have to bring the tickets over on the subway, and the team would give him a ride back on the bus. And he's told me on several occasions he would sit right in front of Jackie Robinson, and they had a number of discussions. He was like 15 years old at the time. But the Vin Scully story that he always tells, he would start during his days as an intern, he would have access to the press box at Ebbets Field. So he would bring his tape recorder. He had this, big reel-to-reel tape recorder back in the mid-'50s, and he would bring it to Dodgers home games. And he would bring along one of his brothers or friends to do color, and they would sit in an empty booth right next to the Dodgers broadcast booth. And it turned out they were so enthusiastic and, I guess, somewhat loud doing the game into the tape recorder that Vin Scully asked them to move down a couple of booths because the audio was bleeding into his broadcast. But that's a true story that I've heard for about the last 50 years about his days as a Dodger intern sitting in the booth next to Vin Scully practicing into a recorder.
Kenny, NBC did a great job with hockey for years. So let's not, for the audience out there, this is not a comparison, but TNT got into the hockey business this year. Kenny, year one's in the books. How does everybody feel about how it went from the Turner point of view?
Everybody feels great, and I totally agree with you, and I'm biased because I worked there, but NBC did an unbelievable job for 15 years, A-plus as far as the presentation of the games. Doc Emmerich, Eddie Olczyk, Pierre Maguire, Brian Boucher, so many others, top-notch broadcasters. And NBC introduced the between-the-glass position, which has probably led to 30 or 40 jobs around the NHL. That never existed before. And to me, one of the biggest aspects, Steve, NBC was the first network in the United States to put every playoff game on television.
Yes.
Prior to that, every game wasn't on nationally. So that was a major leap during the NBC years. But Turner, and I'm so fortunate to be a part of it, I feel like we've taken the baton from NBC and hope to raise everything even higher. It was a great first year. Enjoyed working with Eddie Olczyk and Keith Jones and many of the others who joined us as well. Wayne Gretzky did a game with us up in Hamilton, Ontario. Darren Pang was with us during the playoffs for some of the games. But, I love what they did with the pregame show, bringing them out on the road during the conference final. That was a lot of fun being around those guys. And I sensed the players really enjoyed doing the pregame interviews with the studio gang, with Wayne Gretzky and Paul Bissonnette and Anson Carter and Rick Tocchet, Liam McHugh. It brought out the personalities of some of the players. We did 3 outdoor games. This year we'll have the Stanley Cup Final. So totally agree with you. NBC did an unbelievable job, and hopefully we can raise the bar even higher this past year and for the next 6 years moving forward.
Before I get to the winner, what should it tell us in this era with free agency expansion drafts that the Tampa Bay Lightning won 11 consecutive series.
And Pat Maroon won, 14 straight, 15 straight?
14. 15,
as an individual.
Yeah.
No, they're a great franchise. I remember growing up on Long Island when the Islanders were winning 19 in a row, which might never be matched ever again, when they won the Cups in 83, and then went deep into the Stanley Cup final in 84. No, what Tampa Bay has done is remarkable. Not only winning the Cup 2 straight years, getting to the final this year, but also got to the final in 2015 with a number of the same players who are still around. So that's 4 finals in 8 years, which is hard to do. Like you said, in the salary cap era, you have 32 teams. They battled back, down 2-0 to the Rangers, down 2-0 in Game 3. Were able to win that series, and then, there's certainly no shame in losing to the Colorado Avalanche in the Stanley Cup final. Now, moving forward, they've lost a couple of key players. They couldn't keep everybody due to the cap restrictions, so Ryan McDonough is in Nashville. Andre Palat is in New Jersey. Mm-hmm. I think they'll still be a very formidable team, especially with Andrei Vasilevsky in goal and Victor Hedman and Kucherov and Stamkos and Braden Point right on down the line. But it's not going to be easy. We see the improvements the Florida Panthers made during the offseason and so many of the other teams, but definitely a tip of the cap to the Tampa Bay Lightning for what they've been able to accomplish.
What do you think it meant for the league in general that the Rangers were there, that Connor McDavid won rounds, that Nathan McKinnon, Cale Makar, the star power advanced and was a big part of what was going on? What do you think that meant for the league?
Absolutely. I don't think the league roots for any teams to win or lose, but we actually, that's a great point, Steve. We were talking about that during the conference final. The fact that you had in the East, Tampa Bay, the 2-time defending champions, the New York Rangers in the number 1 market, and then in the West, the series that I worked on the TV side, Colorado, a great team that had not been able to get out of the second round for 4 straight years, but with some superstar players led by Nathan McKinnon and Cale Makar, and then Edmonton. Even though they're a Canadian team and it might affect the TV ratings, but to get to watch Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl, I sensed that the hockey fans around the country, not only in those 4 markets, around North America, were just so into it. In New York, when the Rangers advanced that far, they might not be on the back page of the newspaper more than once or twice during the regular season.
Yeah.
That's just the nature of sports in New York now. Baseball and football have become year-round sports. Basketball is huge. With the Knicks improving last year, making the playoffs 2 years ago, and the whole Nets situation with Durant and Kyrie Irving, that news cycle never seems to end. So it's tough for hockey to break onto the back page of the Post or the Daily News during the regular season. But in the playoffs, it seemed like every other day, which was great. People who aren't even rabid hockey fans were paying attention, and you could feel the buzz in the city. I was up in Edmonton. It was just such a tremendous atmosphere. Colorado as well. So I'm not sure you could have had 4 more, the combination of 4 teams in the conference final, at this time for the NHL than they had last year. There have been years in the past. There was a Carolina Edmonton final, a Tampa Bay Calgary final back in the early 2000s. So that might not have brought out the highest numbers in the television ratings, but then we started to see Pittsburgh and Detroit 2 straight years, Chicago, LA, and New York, a lot of the big markets in the Stanley Cup final, which can only help promote the sport. And the ratings were great this year on both TNT and ESPN, and hopefully that continues moving forward.
How excited are you to get the NFL rolling again?
It's time. We just we had our Fox seminar out in L.A. over the last couple of days. Just got back yesterday, so it was great to see everybody. Aside from our own crew, you don't see the others at all during the course of the year. So to be able to spend some time with Terry Bradshaw and Howie Long and Jimmy Johnson and Sean Payton, all the guys from the pregame shows, and not only to be with my partner, Jonathan Vilma, but to see so many of the other great broadcasters, the play-by-play, the analysts, the color commentators, the sideline reporters from some of the other crews. So that got the blood flowing a little bit. So it's just around the corner, and can't wait to get started.
Kenny, thanks so much for your time. You know how much I appreciate the time and you very much.
Thanks, Steve. Really appreciate it. Hope to chat frequently throughout the year. And I know Penn State football is just around the corner, so have a great season.
I appreciate that. Thanks, Kenny.
Thanks, Steve. Anytime.
Kenny Albert.